before I do anything else, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're all meeting today, which will be many and varied from across Australia. I'm actually outside of Australia today, but when I'm in Australia, home for me is Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation in Sydney. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and just acknowledge the inequity in alcohol and drug-related harm for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends and colleagues and communities. And that's part of what Clean Slate's mission is, to try and tackle some of those inequities, as well as tear down every barrier that we can find to accessing addiction treatment services. Happy to answer questions on that, but today, the focus of today is all about shame. For those of you I haven't met or who don't know me, shame is something I'm certainly familiar with. So I'm here. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Clean Slate Clinic. Also have lived experience of alcohol dependence myself, and was actually client number one to go through the Clean Slate Clinic program that I had co-created. And it took me many, many years to acknowledge that I had a problem and seek help for it. And we'll dive into all the various different areas of my shame, but there were plenty as we go through today's discussion. But absolutely delighted to have a couple of other lived experienced and clinical experts in the room with me today to have this discussion. So I will hand over to Chris Gimple, who has joined the Clean Slate team, to maybe introduce himself and talk a little bit about his own experience.
Thanks, Pia. Yeah, so as Pia mentioned, now, funnily enough, have joined the Clean Slate team. We'll join some gaps in between during this session as to how I've got where I am, but I was a Clean Slate patient almost 12 months ago, just before Christmas. Actually, it's pretty much bang on last year. So I've had sort of the last 12 months of lived experience with the program. I had a long history of alcohol dependence before that, and I'm now hoping to put a lot of those learnings to good use when we're talking about helping anybody else, or just breaking down the actual topic itself and making sense of what might help people. So that's hopefully what today will also bring. I'll pass to Julz to also do an intro. She's much more qualified than I am, so that might take a little bit longer.
Thank you, Chris and Pia. My name's Julz. I am the provisional psychologist here at Clean Slate Clinic, and I've been with the program for about 7 months. Here at Clean Slate, we offer an additional service of brief psychology interventions for people who are going through the program to curb the urges and manage some of the other experiences, anxiety, stresses that come up as you're working through this journey. I've been in the mental health sector for about close to 10 years. And have been working with people who are experiencing mental health challenges alongside alcohol, drug, and other addictive behaviours. I do want to acknowledge before we begin that shame is a really big topic. It's a heavy topic, and sometimes when we talk about shame, things can get stirred up for all of us. So I want to invite everyone to just take a moment for yourself if you need, if anything is getting stirred up. You have our permission to zone out, tune me out, put yourself, turn the volume down and step away if needed. It is a heavy topic and is poorly understood by so many of us. So as we become more and more aware of shame and how it impacts us, some of those feelings, can get challenging.
Julz, and it's such a privilege for us to have you as part of the team, and the work that you do with our clients and supporting them and working through some of these really tricky and deep-seated sort of issues that are just part of the human condition, I guess. But I'm going to ask what sounds like a simple question, but I think it might be quite a difficult one to answer to kick us off, Julz, which is exactly what is shame exactly? Can you sort of explain that for us?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think when we think about shame, we feel like we understand that word, and it does get thrown around quite a bit. But when we look at shame by definition, it really is a core belief about oneself. It's about who we think that we are at the core. And there are a lot of emotions that go with shame that we can call shame emotions. They're not quite what shame is, but they come up as we have this experience. When we are experiencing shame, we often experience a really negative view of ourselves. We feel as though we may be lacking in some area, we're not good enough, less than in some way. And those core beliefs come up as thoughts like, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I don't matter, there's something wrong with me, I've failed, I am a failure. Often our really early experiences and our connections can shape the way that shame comes up for us. And even in really healthy, loving families, shame is something that is embedded quite early into a lot of the systems that we're in. In the schooling system, in the way that we look at grading and the comparisons between us and our peers, in our cultures, in the expectations that we have, particularly in family systems and in cultures where there are really set stereotypes around what different genders and different people within the family need to achieve. And it can really affect our core identity. So it can increase our experience of shame as we go through life. I invite you to just think about times where you felt like you've not been good enough or been less than. This is a human universal experience. It's not something that happens specifically for people who have challenges with addiction. It's something that we all experience in life as we navigate the challenges of everyday life. And shame and guilt are often really confused with one another. Whilst they can happen simultaneously, there is a difference. Shame is really about our inherent selves. It's about what we feel about ourselves. I am not good enough. I am less than. Whereas guilt is more specific to behaviors. I did something bad. I hurt that person. Something that we can often resolve quicker and can appear quicker and dissipate quicker. So, you can apologize for guilt. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry that I was late to that event. But we don't often apologize for shame. We don't often externalize shame because it means having to really face our core beliefs about ourselves and facing something that's really deep and inherent and pervasive to our lives. Shame can often bring up a lot of feelings of hopelessness, like we can't change these beliefs, but work can certainly be done to work through these feelings and to reframe how we feel and how we view ourselves. And the shame beliefs that we carry, they're often unattainable. They're perfectionistic. We hold ourselves to a standard that is really difficult to achieve. And they can have conflicting expectations that bang up against each other to cause shame to increase. Some of the shame emotions that we might feel include things like experiencing fear. So, am I good enough? Will people abandon me if they knew how I really felt about myself? If they could see the real me? That self-hatred that can happen when we're going through that self-talk. I'm a screw up. I don't see how I'm going to be able to get out of this. Sometimes we experience anger or jealousy. We compare ourselves to other people and we feel that we're the only ones struggling or experiencing that shame. And with that can come, that hopelessness and that depression.
Wow. That really resonated so strongly with me, Julz, and I'm sure with many others, but particularly the stuff you were talking about, that sort of failure shame. And whether it was, God, you were taking me right back to my childhood and sort of expectations around exam results, and actually did really well on my exams, but it was, it was such a shame. I got like 10 A's and a B, I think, and it was, my sort of family was sort of such a shame about the B. So maybe that was sort of some of the deep-seated stuff that you start to then build in. And my biggest shame around alcohol use was not being able to control it. So it's that perfectionist thing. So that one really came across for me. And the emotions you described, just in describing them, I found that really helpful, because I think when you're going through those emotions, you don't have that clarity. So it makes a lot of sense when you articulated them, but they sort of feel like a jumble of things. So just hearing those different emotions articulated, I think it can just be helpful for people in breaking them down. But you said that sort of shame is part of the natural human experience, and very prevalent. I'm going to have a little go now at doing a poll and get the audience to do a bit of work and see if they're still listening, and just test whether, how prevalent is shame? Have you guys experienced feelings of shame in relation to any habit or behavior, or indeed just any of your experiences so far? Would love to hear from you. So it's just a little poll that's popped up. I had a feeling I knew which way this might go, just based on Julz's initial articulation then. But yeah, it's powerful, isn't it? So there's not a single person, no one, who hasn't experienced some level of shame in relation to some habit or behavior. And I should say, in the audience, we've got a real mix of people who are in the program, people who are thinking about the program, clinicians. So we've got a cross section of humans here, and everybody's experience or feeling shame. That's a 100% answer there. So that just goes to show how core it is to just part of being human. Well, maybe let's turn then, Julz, more specifically, shared those results, turn more specifically to how shame shows up in addiction, and in the journey when people might be trying to make a change in their relationship to alcohol or any other substance, but perhaps alcohol particularly.
Thank you, Pia. I think that when we were thinking about today's webinar, and talking about shame, it was really important for us to bring this to light, both for our current clients, people who are thinking about making a change, and also for those who are supporting, anyone around that. It's something that comes up quite a lot in my sessions with clients, and not something that people are always often able to point out and name. And shame comes up in all of the stages of working through change around addiction. What we know from the research and from working with clients is that shame is really highly correlated with addiction. And what that means is our research and our clinical practice shows us that higher levels of shame perpetuate more substance use, and that continued ongoing substance use, particularly around alcohol, can also fuel more intense and more frequent feelings of shame. These two things are really correlated with each other, and they feed one another. And shame can be triggered through many stages of our journey with changes with substances. And it's really important to be aware of when these triggers start to happen and how we can manage them. There's often a lot of shame that people experience around wanting to make a change, particularly with alcohol. Thinking about making a change and thinking about, how do I even begin to face this? Just even the thought that we might need help can bring up shame around the fact that, everybody else can manage this and I can't. And that feeling of being different or isolated or less than. What we know, particularly having worked with so many people who are going through this journey, is that we're not alone in that. And the universal experience of struggling with something, each and every one of us has that, whether it be alcohol or other substances or other behaviors that are unhelpful or unhealthy to us. We have all had that experience. And if you meet someone who hasn't had that experience is coming for them. It is universal. And so being able to be okay with needing help, being able to face that, is probably the first part of that shame. Often our addictive behaviors develop in part as a result of some of these shame feelings. It doesn't mean that shame is the reason, the core reason, but it can be a part of that. Some examples of that might include, times where we feel we didn't belong. So we drank to fit in. times where we felt socially awkward at a work event or a family event, so we drank to reduce the tension. We're having challenges at work or in our family life, so we drink at the end of the day to have something to relax to escape those feelings. These are just some really simple examples of how shame can perpetuate our cycles of addictive behavior, specifically around alcohol, how feeling less than can have an impact on our behaviors around addiction. But shame can also show up when we're making a change, when we make the decision to finally join a program. But shame makes us hide the fact that we're joining this wonderful program from our close friends and family. You know, shame can make us feel like we're the only ones with the problem. So we hide the fact that we're finally deciding to make a really positive change in our lives from important people. And this is really pertinent when it comes to changes with alcohol consumption. If we think about, for example, you know, somebody who's deciding to quit smoking, you know, we rock up to our work day and somebody says, oh, do you want to go outside and have a cigarette? And we say to our work colleague, actually, I've decided to quit smoking. And we feel positive about that. And our colleague responds and says, well done, that's awesome, you're making a change, fantastic. And the blame gets put on the nicotine. It's the nicotine that's the problem. And the person making the change is praised. But if we compare that to alcohol use, we rock up to, you know, Friday night after work celebrations and somebody says, oh, I'll grab you a beer. And we say, actually, I've decided to quit alcohol, or I'm not drinking. And the response sometimes is met differently. It's a bit abrupt. It's, oh, is there a problem? Or, oh, come on, you know, have one beer. It's a completely different feeling when we're talking about alcohol and the stigma around making a change when it comes to alcohol. It's so widely accepted. It's so embedded in our culture, in our societal fabric, in work, in higher education, in our, you know, early youth, that it's very different when it comes to not drinking. And the shame that we carry around that, it can make that stage of change very difficult. It can make us isolate, it can make us feel rejected, and it can make us hide these changes. But shame also is experienced along the journey when we're kicking goals in detox and when we're staying alcohol free. But then we feel like we have to create stories around why that is. You know, we constantly feel we need to make a plan about what we're going to say to that person at that work event, particularly in this December period where we have these increased social expectations. There may be a constant need to tell a story instead of confronting this really positive change and the goals that we've kicked. It also comes up in our setbacks around our changes with alcohol or other drugs. We might be proud of what we've achieved, but then we feel really pervasive shame around any hurdles or any setbacks or even the urges that we might experience, which are a part of any change. You know, when you get to the gym and you decide, all right, I'm on a health kick, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to eat healthy, and we miss a day, we don't beat ourselves up for that. You know, you might feel guilt. You might go, oh, I should have gone today. Oh, you know, it would have been good. I might have felt better. But you decide, you know what, I'll go tomorrow. It's fine. The guilt doesn't transition into this deep shame. But if we experience an urge or we experience a lapse, we put ourselves in the doghouse. We say that we failed, that we are failures. And that guilt turns into shame. When setbacks and hurdles are a part of any change process, it's that inner critic that brings us to feeling as though we are somehow less than, we should be ashamed, we are failures. And these are just some examples of how shame can come up in our change through addiction.
Julz, and yeah, again, really resonated. And I might share a little bit of my own sort of experience along the journey and the different points at which I experienced shame as well. I'm going to come to you in a second, Chris, but I did say to attendees I wanted to make this a conversation, and I encourage questions, and I encourage people to put your questions to us again. So I just want to come to one of the questions that's come in for one of our attendees who said, I'm overweight and I feel shame about that often. How can I overcome this feeling when people have certain expectations around weight? And as you rightly called out, you call out the point as they do around alcohol consumption. And I know we'll get into a discussion around sort of practical tools and techniques, but I think that talks to that sort of that inner critic, that inherent lack of self-acceptance. What would your advice be, Julz, in terms of the first steps around that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And even the fact that you've been able to put it into this chat is a really good step with facing something that you're feeling less than for. You know, I think shame often allows us to develop these shame personas, our ideal selves, what we wish we could be, versus our true self, who we inherently are. And inside those two differences, that shame persona and our true selves, there's a critic there. There's something that's judging us. You know, particularly when it comes to body image, our health, there are unrelenting standards that we face around what a successful person is, what a good or a winning person looks like. And I think being able to name that you're having an experience, a challenge with your health, and being able to set yourself small goals around that, even the concept of being able to say, this is a problem area for me that I need to address, is the first step in being able to make a change. And we've all had experiences with people around us who have said, you know what, I'm going to start my journey of going to the gym. I need to lose 10 kilos, and this is what I'm doing. And when we face those people, think about how you perceive that. Do you perceive that person to be a failure, somebody who needs to make a change, or is it a success to you to watch that person identify something in their life and start to work on it? The kindness that we give to that other person for being able to identify an area that is challenging for them and then make a change. We have to try and provide that self-compassion to ourselves. So I actually honor you for being able to put this in the chat and to face that part of yourself, to say, here's an area for me that's a challenge, and how can I work through this? That's really the first step to getting closer to your true self and to stripping away that shame persona, those masks that we put on to cover our insecurities. And I think some of the strategies that we talk about when it comes to facing shame around alcohol use will be really helpful in this area for you.
Thanks, Julz. And we'll come on to some of those after. And I love one of the things we came up when we were sort of chatting about putting this webinar together, which is, you know, just naming and shaming shame is a great first step to say, actually, that this isn't a deficit, this isn't a me problem, this is a shame issue. And that's the bit that we want to try and tackle. So yeah, as you say, great first step. Chris, I'm going to come to you to talk a little bit perhaps about your journey. And Julz talked about a number of points when you're going through thinking about seeking help, making choices around making a change, maybe even before that stage. And then, you know, feeling shame about being part of a program, shame about lapses potentially. Would love to hear in a bit more detail sort of what that was like for you, and maybe key points along your journey that you just remember really feeling that shame feeling.
Yeah, thanks, Pia. And thanks, Julz, for all that info too. I took a lot out of that already. Yeah, so where to start? I mean, I guess it's easier now for me to reflect now that I've sort of had a decent break from alcohol use. In saying that, though, I always quite knew what I was relying on wasn't healthy. So I certainly don't profess to always be as smart as most people around, but I still knew what I was doing was the wrong choices. But as poor as it sounds, I just didn't really care as much at that point. I didn't, you know, and Julz touched on self-compassion, and probably a separate webinar topic, but you know, depression and anxiety for me is very closely linked to those shame thoughts and or guilt of what I'm doing. I did really like how you split that out, Julz, though, that the shame is the I am something, and normally a negative that we put on it, and the guilt is I can't believe I did something. So I think that stood out for me because I would often just be saying I am something, and normally, you know, I didn't have a high value of myself, and therefore when other parts of me said, you know, this isn't really great, that you are drinking to feel better, and actually by the, you know, to drink to feel normal, really, not even necessarily doing massive dances in the room every evening. It was just to actually try and feel what I thought was somewhat normal. So that was something that was pretty regular for me. But for my journey, I actually sort of probably felt shame first when my family was noticing that I was unhealthy and was hurting myself, and also I did even sort of say to them I was good and lucky that it was something that would politely be mentioned or talked about whenever I visited, because for context, I was in Sydney, just moved back to Brisbane, but I was in Sydney for 10 years and family always in Brisbane. So that also probably didn't help with my habits, because I actually went months without seeing them. They didn't see that I was drinking at home every day. And it's amazing now that I'm more involved with Clean Slate and speaking to people weekly. If anyone's out there thinking, oh, but I drink at home and I must be the only one, I reckon I can't put the exact number on it, but I reckon it's probably about 80% of people are actually at home by themselves, or with not too many people around. So it's funny how society, I think, almost paints it as the alcoholic problem is the person out there in the nightclubs when they're trying to close. You know, of course, those things might happen, but quite often it's just a contained thing that not a lot of people can see. But yeah, the shame for me was probably just about understanding that the family were upset or concerned. And in actual fact, that was my first reason why I wanted to get help. It wasn't actually for myself. I've gotten so much better I'm in a much better place now where I do see the value of not hurting myself if I can avoid it, which alcohol can easily do. But at the time, I actually started my journey not even for myself. I was doing it for my family. So that was an interesting one, because I do wonder and if some people don't start their journey because they're waiting to actually want to do it for themselves. So yes, deep down, there's probably very good reason that people should and will eventually realize that they are worth it themselves. But there's other reasons you can get going, I guess is my point. So that was probably an interesting start to me accepting that there's something I should change. And it wasn't, I certainly don't want to be misunderstood. It wasn't to get people off my back or anything like that. I really genuinely didn't want other people to worry. So that was probably the first experience I had with shame. Just the other probably main stage before we sort of talk about a little bit more the journey, but before seeking help or help seeking, yeah, it's super funny, Julz, how you gave those examples of the nicotine versus the alcohol, and just people very quickly I found I didn't have too many people that weren't supportive, but I have seen a lot of examples where it doesn't quite go to plan. And people often in our smart recovery groups might give examples where friends or family are not as keen for the person to seek help. And generally it's a reflection on somebody else and their own behaviors. It's not to point fingers at anyone, but you know, there's often a good reason. And I think I wrote down, yeah, choosing a change, you know, should be celebrated. That's certainly how I feel. And for those that don't do it now or don't do it, just ditch them. That's the best advice I could give. because there's just so much better stuff out there. And don't fall in the trap of trying to figure out, why does this person not care, or is it the right decision? If you're even thinking about it, you've got to take a bit of a leap of faith, and you've got to just try and just see where you might end up. But it's much better than doing nothing. That's probably my sort of first reflections, Pia, on shame, and just starting to think about making some changes. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, and I'll share some of the sort of key, I can share my residual shame as well, but some of the key points that I remember from my experience. But one of the things she said really struck a chord with me there, which was around, so you describe a lot of, your reasons for change were really a sort of people-pleasing reason. And I know when we have our smart recovery groups, the ones that I run, I find lots of that sort of people-pleasing type characters in those groups. And I wanted to ask you, Julz, is there a correlation between a sort of people-pleasing character, or that as a sort of characteristic, and higher levels of shame? Is that sort of quite a common correlation?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And
Julz, sorry. Sorry, Julz.
That's okay. No, that's fine. I think that this people-pleasing characteristic that a lot of us have, it often comes from the need to feel validation externally, rather than holding that internal validation. And our society is set up for that, for these external validation triggers. Being able to find the part of yourself that is inherently valuable to you can make us take steps towards choosing ourselves. If we always choose others, and not in a we're a saint and we do everything for everyone, but if we choose others in the way that our actions are to appease what somebody might think, to not make other people uncomfortable, to drink because what would other people say if we didn't, or maybe we wouldn't get the invitation, or people needed me all day today, and so I went and I went and I went and I did for others. And at the end of the day, after you have done all of that and expended all that energy on other people's perceived needs, sometimes we feel we have to take something for ourselves. And often that taking that happens at the end of a hard day is destructive and unhelpful. It might be that, okay, well, I just really need to crack this bottle open because I'm empty. I'm feeling empty now because I've given so much of myself away. And when we feel that need to take, it is often in ways like gambling, excessive eating, excessive exercise, it might be, consuming alcohol or other drugs, in a way to fill up what we've given away. And that often leads to shame cycles. I talked earlier about that inner critic that we have that compares our true self, who we really are, to our ideal self, this person we are trying to achieve. This reinforces us putting on masks to please people. It reinforces us to continue to do things that actually don't honor ourselves. And then that feeds more sense of shame. And being able to start becoming aware of those shame patterns is really a part of that first journey, whether it's about alcohol or whether it's about our relationship with food, our diet, our exercise. Becoming aware of our shame patterns can really begin that journey of healing shame. And what I mean by shame patterns is when we experience shame, we often experience, negative thoughts, those thoughts that we talked about before. We beat ourselves up, we ruminate, we obsess over an event, something that we said, what people might think of us. And that thought leads to our shame emotions. We get angry, we're afraid, we're anxious, we feel depressed. Like Chris said, that depression and anxiety and how closely that is linked. And all of those thoughts and those emotions then lead to our actions. We isolate to avoid people, like Chris said, not seeing family for so long. We stop going to social activities. We oversleep. We overeat. We drink at home at night, but we don't tell anybody what's going on. And we put our masks back on to people please. The thoughts, the emotions, the actions, that cycle is pervasive. And a part of the journey, the first part of the journey, is recognizing that we're actually in those patterns, and we have to break that circuit to be able to heal through the shame and change the addictive behaviors.
It's not necessarily a quick fix, is it? But I'm going to come. I think there's a really important question that's been asked in the Q&A, which I'll come to in just a second. But it's probably the little bit that the residual shame that I hold, still the work that I need to do, is on the people pleasing side. So it's going to an event where I still drink on special occasions. That's sort of my boundaries that I've set for myself. I feel shame about that because I'm an advocate for, but I'm also an advocate for everybody to choose the goals they want to set for themselves. That's my goal, but I still feel ashamed of it. But it's also on the days that I choose not to drink and I don't want to drink, I feel shame because I feel like I'm not meeting the expectations of the other people in that room. I'm letting down the party. I'm letting down the dinner table. So that's a bit of work that I still have left to do. But I want to come to the question because it links to and thank you so much for whoever's put this into the Q&A, because you will not be the only one experiencing this, but that relationship between your shame and your relationships with other people. So the question to this, Julz, so the attendee feels immense shame, or I feel immense shame around my alcohol consumption. Like Chris, it happened quietly at home. My question is how to respond to a partner that reacts to my lapses in a manner that causes a feeling of shame within myself. So, for example, get up in the morning to make breakfast and find the empty bottle that my husband had found with a written note stuck to it telling me how disappointed he was to find that I'd hit the wine yet again. And I'm not sure how to respond in that situation due to the massive wave of shame that hits me. And I wonder whether you had sort of advice for this attendee, and also perhaps support for her other half as well, because it probably takes two to solve some of those challenges. But yeah, interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for whoever posted this. It's very brave and something that a lot of people experience. Those shame triggers that happen as a result of how other people are responding, and particularly our intimate partners and our family. I can imagine that, when you wake up and you see something like this, it hits you like a ton of bricks. And it is a shame trigger. It's a part of that cycle, the trigger of what the other person has responded with, and the thought that comes up, and the emotions that follow, and the actions. The thought that comes up, okay, here I am again, I've failed. And the emotions that come up, I'm feeling, low, I am feeling hopeless. How am I going to get through this? And the action, likely open a bottle, try and numb that feeling of pain. So being able to recognize that this is a trigger, and actually sitting down with your support people and talking about how this trigger actually leads to more unhelpful behaviors. How can we respond together to help break that cycle? It's not an easy conversation to have, and particularly for support people who might be overwhelmed or exhausted or not have support for themselves. It is a very difficult situation to sit down and talk about how these types of situations, how these responses and behaviours actually lead to more drinking. I think that recognition that this type of response leads to more unhelpful behaviours, that recognition that this is a part of the cycle, might actually open eyes of our support people to be able to sit down and want to make a change. It doesn't always go that way. But if we can sit down and recognize that, I understand that you're frustrated, and the way that you're releasing your frustration is through trying to bring that to my attention, it's actually causing me to feel more shame. And when I feel more shame, I get low about myself. And when I get low about myself, I need to do something to bring myself back up. And that doing is drinking. Then I wake up again, feel more shame. Then I feel worse. Then I drink again. And really recognizing that cycle with each other can help you put some things in place to be able to try and break it. It might be, instead of sticking that note on the bottle for me to find in the morning, can we sit down and talk about what happened yesterday and make a plan for today? Can we sit down and talk about what we might be able to do together tonight, so that if I come home and I'm not feeling so good, I don't reach for my regular patterns of behaviour, I know that we have some options here for support for me. And if your support people are not responding or are not open to that, it's important that you find other support people. That's not to say that you should leave all of your relationships. I know it's not that easy, but being able to have another person to reach out to when you're feeling that shame so that you're not sitting in that cycle.
I found it incredibly helpful bringing my husband along to one of my early appointments because, you know, he didn't know how he was supposed to respond and what he was supposed to do and what would be most helpful and not. So I think that's brilliant advice. Thanks, Julz. Chris, I know that question resonated for you as well. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, for sure. And again, like you said, thank you so much for posing the question, because it brings up so many good things to touch on. For me, when I think about that example, a few things. Something that's really helped me, and it doesn't actually mean that you have to have already started your journey with Clean Slate, or even having a break yourself from consumption, is to just take some time to understand why you may have drunk that particular night or in a particular occasion. What was it that you were trying to work through, if anything? Sometimes I found that when I did this to myself, I had to really spend some time on it. You can't perfect it straight away, but you're just unpacking. Actually, it was because I was feeling a bit of guilt, probably for drinking the night before. And so therefore I would get rid of that by drinking the next day, even though the sober Chris had told myself, today's the day that I can just not drink, I reckon. Because, and it's funny, people are very used to that part of drinking. Oh, I'm never drinking again. That was just like such a big weekend, or, but then funnily enough, as soon as we start to feel better, that feeling's gone. And then quite often the drinking is more accepted because you're feeling better. So yeah, I think understanding why we're drinking, but understanding that it's not your fault. It's not quite often, for me as well, it was not a conscious decision. It was a learnt behavior. My brain was doing it. And something I've found useful is actually thinking about my brain as a separate thing. I know this sounds a bit weird, but it's kind of like my brain actually did those choices. It's not the sober Chris that was acting at that time. It's actually a different part of me, and therefore I didn't have as much control. And for those that maybe haven't struggled with drinking or addiction or something, I think that, for me, I think personally that that's what they struggle to find. It's like, why can't you just say no? Why can't you just not do it? But I'm not sitting there with a really good decision-making brain saying it's going to be a great idea if I drink tonight. It's going to lead to so many good things for the next few days. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just doing what I already have done so many times before, because that's the easiest thing for me to act out. So the fact that your husband has left a message, in my view, means he does care, because he doesn't actually have to notice. He doesn't have to even raise it yet. And yes, that it means that he either doesn't want you to be hurting yourself, or it means that he doesn't like perhaps some of the things that you might decide to do when you're drinking. So to me, that's a really good starting point. That, I mean, like Julz said, that conversation can quickly turn to, like, I'm up against it here. Can I explain to you what it feels like for me, and then let's work out a plan.
Thanks, Chris. I want to turn now, Julz, and we've started talking about some of this already, and just a reminder again to attendees, if you have any other questions for Julz or any other one of us, please drop them in the Q&A, and you can do it anonymously. But to make sure we spend a bit of time on, so how do we, what are the tools and techniques that we can use to overcome shame? And I might just, maybe we'll go into it through the lens of lapse, only because I wanted to make sure I mention this to attendees, because I think it's one of the biggest points. Like, shame after lapse is one of the biggest risk points for people for relapse, and for people sort of disappearing off the program or feeling like a failure like that. I remember the most acute moment of shame in my journey was when I lapsed. And it was the feeling of shame was so bad. The guilt and shame, but the shame was so strong that I can easily see how that could have been a moment where I gave up. And so maybe using that as the entry point, because I think that's such a big one. Julz, what are some of the tools and techniques that we can use to overcome shame?
Yeah, really good point around lapse. And I think Chris touched on it on taking a step back and realizing that these are learnt behaviors. This is not inherently because you are bad or you are a failure, and the things that shame brings up and makes us think about. Working on those core values and really understanding the difference between what's going on in our brain when we're deciding to take that drink, or not consciously deciding, but when it's happening. When we're in that state, the limbic brain, the emotional part of our brain, it's our early part of our brain, our child brain. It gets up and it makes that decision for us. It's not actually something that we're consciously working on choosing every day. If we felt we could, we all would stop immediately, just like that. When a child gets up in the morning and they say, "Oh, I don't feel good today. I don't feel like going to school, so I shouldn't have to go." How they feel determines what is real for them. That's the emotional part of the brain. It's the limbic brain that's thinking at that time. And when we experience shame in the morning from our loved one, our brain goes straight into that limbic part of the brain. I don't feel I'm good enough, so I'll treat myself like I'm less than. The limbic brain is going, I don't feel I'm good enough, so I shouldn't have to do these things that are going to help me. And in order to heal from this, we need to start reframing these thoughts. We need to consciously work on reframing. We need to turn down the limbic brain and step into our other brain that actually helps us make executive decisions, which is our cortex. When we're starting to think about, oh God, this note, I've seen it, it's on the bottle, I've failed again. We need to talk to ourselves to reframe. It seems silly and it sounds silly, but it's the first step in bringing ourselves out of those cycles. Okay, I did this. I could have done better, but I know that I'm worthy. I know that I can try, can make a change. I have value. I need to take care of myself. And I'm going to treat myself today by taking care of myself. I'm not going to feed the guilt. I'm taking a step back. I'm realizing that my brain is in this shame cycle and there's negative talk here. I'm going to remind myself that I need to do just one good thing. Self-talk, introspection, looking at those negative processes that are happening. And as a part of that healing, being able to step into more positive framing, catch yourself in the thought, make a visceral change. And what we call this in psychology is cognitive reconstructing. Changing those thoughts that we're having and being able to speak to ourselves in a positive way, reshaping our value to help us believe in ourselves that we can make a change. It's the first step. Giving yourself time and self-care. And what that might mean is just getting up and making a meal for ourselves, nourishing ourselves through our food, exercising, making social connections, actually facing these decisions that we're making by talking to our loved ones. It's a part of that acceptance and that growth, and a part of being able to actually take the mask off and start living in our true selves. Being able to work through the urges, not just the urges for alcohol, but the urges that we experience when we're feeling shame. The urge to sit in that shame, to sit in those feelings and to continue feeling those emotions that then ultimately lead to the shame actions, which are the behaviors we're trying to avoid in the first place. And when we think about lapse, we think about struggles, failures, hurdles. When we look at the example of a baby who starts to walk for the first time, they get up, they fall. They get up, they fall. And every time they fall, how do people around them react? We clap and we say, good job, try again. But when we fall, we don't face that with the same sort of kindness. The process of change is up and down and up and down, and that is the process for everyone. And being able to actually offer ourselves some of that kindness is really important when we're looking at how to make changes with shame and with addictive behaviours. Another really important part, particularly when it comes to lapse, is having boundaries. So not just boundaries with our loved ones, but boundaries with ourselves. Boundaries with saying yes to things when we really want to say no. Being able to choose yourself and give to yourself so that your whole day isn't spent people pleasing or giving to others and then having nothing left for ourselves. Nothing left. You end up needing to take something. And what we take is far more destructive than if we just give to ourselves throughout the day. You know, boundaries with people who might trigger our shame. And a lot of the time, this can be with people like those in our family of origin, our parents, our siblings, people who we first developed these coping mechanisms with. We might need to have boundaries with them around how much time we're spending with them, around how much we're allowing them to interfere with our change process, but also around boundaries of how you're talking about your change. Are you talking about it truthfully? Are you meeting your change and speaking to others and to yourself about the change that you're making, or are you hiding it? You know, all of that is another mask that we have to wear that takes our energy away from what we're actually trying to achieve. Connecting with healthy people. And what I mean by healthy people is risk being authentic with safe people. Speak to people about your journey. Connect with other people who are also going through that journey. And that's a wonderful part of this program, is that there are so many people, as Chris and Pierre would attest to, that are also going through that same experience. When you're feeling like it's only me that feels this way, and then you meet so many other people who are speaking literally as if they're sitting right next to you in your home, watching your experiences. There's power in that. We all have these experiences, and we're not alone in that at all. And giving kindness to yourself around this massive journey that you're taking smoking. When we decide to make a change around smoking, we don't say to ourselves, well, I'm a smokeaholic. We go from smoking to non-smoking. It's as simple as that. And so being able to give ourselves compassion for the fact that we need to make a change and the fact that we've decided to make a change, that's something to be met with actual praise. It's courageous, it's brave. It's not something to feel shame about, although we do experience that.
Thanks, Julz. And we're running tight on time, which always happens. I said this would happen. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A for you, Julz. One is, you made the comment that we have the urge to remain sitting in the shame. Why is that? Why are we compelled to do that? What makes us do that?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think it's important for us to look at these shame cycles again. Like Chris said, it is a learned behavior. We experience the thought. It's often the thought that happens first. Oh, I'm a failure because of a trigger. And from that thought, we ruminate, we sit in that thought, we beat ourselves up. And that brings on naturally an emotion. Well, I feel low, or I feel anxious, or I feel guilty about what I did. And not being able to actually break that cycle will lead to the action again. And that action will lead to the thought, and we spiral in that cycle. So catching yourself, taking a moment and going, okay, I've actually been thinking about this. I've been ruminating on these feelings for 20 minutes. I need to get up and make a change. It might be getting up and going outside for a walk. It might be getting up and making a phone call and talking to somebody about how you're experiencing this shame, so that you aren't going through that cycle, which ultimately leads to the behavior. It is not something that is easy to do, breaking these learned patterns, and it often requires support. So recognizing it is a part of the journey, but also being okay with saying, I actually need help to break through these cycles, is a part of that too.
Thanks, Jules. And then the next question, I think, is probably the topic for an entire hour-long webinar. So it's unfair for me to even ask you. But is there anything sort of quick fire in response to how, and we can do this as a separate webinar. I'll be putting a questionnaire up at the end of this to see what people would find helpful as another webinar. How do we address traumatic earlier experiences that drinking helps us to forget? Is there a short answer to that question, Jules? Possibly not.
Oh, I wish that there was. And I think if there was, I probably would be out of a career. But, you know, a lot of us drink to numb the experiences that we have had so many challenges with. And often when we stop drinking, we hope that we're going to feel better. And in some ways we do, but in other ways, a lot of the things that we've been masking are coming up for us. And this is a really important step to recognize, okay, I'm now experiencing all of these flashbacks or these memories or just emotions that I don't know what they're related to. It's the step for you to start engaging in support. Holding that by yourself is torture. And that support might be with your loved ones. It might be seeking some counselling. It might be with your already existing medical supports. But all of that deserves a space to be able to be unpacked in a really supportive way. I don't, unfortunately, have a quick fix for that.
Can potentially do another webinar on that at a later day, because I think that's a deep topic to get into. There's another question that came up, which I'll attempt to give an answer to, because it's very similar to the question from earlier, which is what do we do with the shame that my husband puts on me every day that adds to my own shame? And we heard about this experience earlier, and what was really helpful for me is, my husband was doing that as well, but he didn't realize he was doing that. And so having him join a consultation with my nurse, and so that he could ask the expert directly, what should I do? What behaviors that I'm doing are helpful or not helpful? I think is if you can achieve that and get your husband with you, and having that conversation directly with the nurse. So it's not you saying I need this or I need that, because that they may not listen, but they might. Well, my husband certainly doesn't listen to me, but he'll listen to the expert. So that I found really helpful. And I think the other thing is, as Jules said, if your support person isn't giving you the support that you need, then you've got to expand that support network to find those that are. And I'm going to do a plug for the Smart Recovery groups that Chris and I and others run every week at Clean Slate, which is a really supportive environment that can be part of that, part of your toolkit and part of your support network. We are on the very last minute. I am going to send I'm happy to look at doing more sessions. I'm going to send a survey out straight after this. And on that, we'll include a question around, so it should pop up in your browser when I end the webinar. We'll include a question just about how this has gone. It's only 5 questions in total, but also any topics you would find helpful. I'm very happy to look at doing future webinars. But we are out of time. Thank you for sticking. I can see everybody stuck with us. So that's great. Thank you so much for staying with us for the presentation, and Julz, for your wisdom and your insights and some really practical advice for people, and Chris for sharing your experiences. And I think just people getting to hear that they're not alone. It's what I hear every week, is one of the biggest factors in helping to break down some of that shame. I hope this has been useful to attendees, and look forward to seeing you at the next one, and wishing you all happy and healthy holiday season, as we are now well and truly into silly season. So thanks again, and we'll wrap up there. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Chris. Thanks all.